After 3 games of the World Chess Championship, the score was level. Today, Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces. The question was, how would he react after this terrible loss from yesterday? Well, we know that Magnus loves to play positions where there are a few pieces on the board where he can apply his incredible endgame technique. And today he got one of those kind of positions on the board. So here he is. Well, objectively, this position is rather level. But Magnus has a little bit of hope. These pawns are isolated. Potentially, one could attack those. And also, there is the hope that white could, in some circumstances, use this distant pawn majority on the queen side. Here I was expecting Magnus to play queen e5. Now, I think the knight endgame might present black with a few difficulties. So maybe queen d8, and then perhaps knight d4, just blockading this pawn. And, well, again, I think objectively this is equal. But white has maybe a little bit of hope here. But instead, Magnus played knight e5, and this seemed slightly odd to me because it's taking the blockader away from the d pawn, and it just feels on a slightly wobbly square. In fact, this was a tactical oversight from Magnus. Vishy played queen f5, and basically Magnus's intention was to play knight c6, threatening the pawn on a7 and also a check on e7, but then comes knight f4 check. And you can see the queen checks the king and hits the knight on c6. So Magnus had to backtrack and he played the knight to d3. But that knight on d3, somehow, it's not protected by a pawn, it's only protected by the queen, and it's not that solidly placed. Vishy exploited this by playing knight d4, attacking white's queen. Of course, that queen has to hang on to the knight. And if, say, queen e8 check, and then the queen comes back protecting the knight, well then queen e4 is, well, certainly black doesn't stand worse in this knight endgame, because you can see black has a space advantage, and the queen, black's king can enter to the centre very quickly. White's king is kind of cut out of the action, and I think in this case, well, it's going to be very difficult to get this pawn majority going. I think, again, that's probably a draw, but white certainly doesn't stand better. So Carlsen played his pawn forward to g4. And the idea is that, well, for example, if black were to go for an ending like this, then here you can see that because of the pawn on g4, black is unable to support that pawn with f5. That's the difference. So g4 is a very ambitious move because, of course, it does slightly expose white's king, and that's dangerous. If knight takes queen, then pawn takes queen, and that's a different kind of knight endgame, because here white's king can enter the centre very quickly, and then, well, maybe that queen side pawn majority will mean something. But once again, Anand reacted excellently. He pushed the queen back to d7, really solid. And after queen e5, the white's queen is still attacked, so the queen moved forward. And now knight e6, an excellent square for the knight, very solidly protected. And you never know, it might be able to hassle white's king at some moment. So the king came up the board. Queen b5 from Vishy, excellent move. So you can see now the queen wants to hassle the knight and maybe get closer to white's king. Good move. Carlsen under a bit of pressure here. He still had 4 moves to make to the time control at move 40, and he had under a minute to get those 4 moves in. So Carlsen clearly isn't at his best at the moment because he's getting short of time. Vishy not in much time pressure at all. Carlsen played a good move. I think the position started to get complicated, so he exchanged knights. Queen b4 check from Vichy, maybe g5 was a better move here. And when the king comes back, queen f1. The point of playing g5 is to give the king a little room here. And black's queen gets enough counterplay, hitting pawns, and the queen can hassle the king as well. Should be a draw. But Vichy played queen b4. Played this a bit too quickly, actually. He simply thought that his pawn would provide enough counterplay, even after giving up this pawn on f7. This was the game continuation. So Carlsen has won a pawn, and Vichy had assumed that he could give a check, and when the king goes back, then d3 provides enough counterplay, and white would simply have to make a draw by perpetual check. But here the king can go forward. He only appreciated this after the time control was reached. And in this case, after d3, queen f3 is an excellent move, and white picks up the d pawn. So here, well, Vichy had time. It was after the time control, so he had another hour on the clock to think things through, and he found the best move. There was no panic. He played queen d2, ready to support the d pawn. And in this case, if the king comes forward, well, this doesn't work as well, because after queen f3, queen takes a2, and, well, if queen takes pawn, then queen takes f2, and it's a level endgame. Well, Carlsen wasn't finished yet. He tried queen f5 check. The king came back, and he tried this tricky move, h4. So suddenly what he's trying to do is to get some pressure on black's king. So for example, after d3, he advances his g-pawn. Now he's trying to set up a mating net. For example, g6, threatening queen f8, and black doesn't have time to make a queen. But once again, Vichy reacted correctly. He simply took the pawn on a2. So now there's a threat to take on b3. White played queen e6, protecting the pawn. There's still a threat to advance this g-pawn, but Vichy reacted quite correctly. I mean, there are still a few traps here. For example, after queen e2, then the queens could be exchanged and white gets a winning ending. But queen d2 is a precise move, preventing g5, and Carlsen saw nothing better than to make a draw by perpetual check. So they just repeated the position here. And a draw. So that was after 5 hours play, a really exhausting game. A rather uneven game from Carlsen. Just when you thought he might be getting somewhere and performing one of his legendary squeezes, then he played inaccurately, and Anand played a very solid game today indeed. So the scores after 4 games still level, but after the game, certainly Anand looked the happier of the two players. Carlsen said in the press conference, "My last 2 games have been pretty bad, so I have to improve." Well, the players have a rest day tomorrow, and they play the 5th game on Friday. Do join me for a report after that game. Thanks a lot.